With WA's financial fortunes hitched to China and the global economy, many here are anxiously eyeing the unfolding drama in Europe. As Greece lurches from crisis to crisis, attention has now turned to Italy. Some fear with a debt of $2 trillion, a default by Italy could mean disaster for the European Union and trigger a new global recession. Macquarie stockbroker Bevan Sturgis-Smith is one of those watching the situation closely, and I spoke with him earlier. Bevan Sturgis-Smith, welcome to 7:30 WA and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, the last time we spoke, we were talking about the debt crisis in the United States and a potential default there. For months we've been talking about Greece. Now the attention is focused on Italy. What's the concern now?
Oh, well, it definitely is Europe. Maybe not necessarily the individual countries. It just seems there's a bit of a contagion effect, or people are looking at country by country now. We sort of got Greece solved. Not in the long term, I don't think, but temporarily, and so straight away the market's looking, where's the next problem? And that's a real feeling that we've got, certainly in our business, if you like, that the market seems to be looking for that little bit of bad news, or where's the next bit of bad news coming from? So it's a little bit of a pessimistic feeling around it. But as you say, when we spoke a few months ago, it was US issues. They seem to have resolved themselves again in the shorter term, and straight away the market was looking elsewhere. And so at the moment, it's Italy, Greece last week, and next week, who else? Who knows?
Now Greece has been a tumbling economic train wreck for months now, but Italy's in a different category, isn't it? Much larger economy, much more at stake.
Oh, most definitely. And it's actually a much stronger economy as well. In fact, I think the last quarter, their budget is in surplus. So they're not running huge deficits, for instance, like Greece is, and the economy is actually a bit stronger. Their GDP growth and those sorts of things is much better. So that gives them a much better position. But when you have that spike in bond rates, that sort of tends to be an indicator these days that something is not quite right, you have to take a look, and that's what the markets are doing at the moment.
So tell us about these bond rates. Why is the attention settled on bond rates, particularly in the last couple of days?
Well, if we look over the last couple of years, when people have been concerned about debt crises, particularly sovereign debt crises, it's when the bond rates spike in those sovereign debt issues, and there's a bit of a level, if you like, that when it goes over, people start worrying about defaults and those sorts of things, because it creates issues for the country. And over the last few days, Italy's bond rate has spiked above that sort of barrier that most people have been looking at, and so the attention has become quite strongly on there. So obviously they did fall back a little bit last night, but they're still above that sort of hurdle that people are concerned about. So
what's that critical number? Because I think in the case of places like Ireland and Portugal and Greece, it was a precursor to a bailout requirement, wasn't it?
It was, and I think that's the hurdle we've pretty much seen with Italy, and that's why people all of a sudden become concerned. So, but as we spoke about before, I think Italy's in a very different situation. I don't think it's near a bailout, but that's what the market is telling us. But I'm not quite sure the market's got it quite right just at the moment with Italy.
So what's the market's focused on then? The size of its debt, because it's got $2 trillion in debt, 120% of GDP. Is that not a concern? It's only a concern if they can't meet it.
In the end, that's the big concern. But what you have to remember with Italy has had a fairly significant size sovereign debt for a number of years. It hasn't just run it up in the last couple of years. If you look over the last 20 years, their sovereign debt has been quite large. But yes, that's the issue. When the bond rates spike or the interest rates spike, being able to service that debt is what becomes the problem. And also when bond rates spike, it slows down economic growth, which is how you actually produce the income to service the debt. Bit like a dog chasing its tail sometimes, but it's an unfortunate situation.
So is there a cycle of pessimism that's being driven by the market here? I mean, is the market creating this spike?
Sometimes it feels that way. When we come into work every day and you see what's happened in Europe and the US overnight, it always seems to be a preponderance of negativity, or looking for that little bit of negativity, and it just creates more pessimism, if you like. And that filters down to the actual people who operate in the market. You're perhaps more prepared to take positions where you take an advantage if the market goes negatively, and that again creates problems in itself, or creates more negativity. So it's quite complex, but it's just at the feeling at the moment is that the market is looking for the next negative piece of news.
So does that mean that if Italy does stabilise and that the confidence in Italy returns, that the market will then focus on Portugal or France? I mean, is that what we're in for? Months and months, perhaps years of this sort of pessimism?
Well, I hate to be pessimistic, but yes, that's what it feels like. If you look back a couple of weeks ago, there was the Greek bailout, then there was the issue about potential referendum and all those sorts of things, and then it sort of calmed down. Within 2 days, the market was talking about Italy. So I guess I'm a little concerned that if Italy does resolve itself in a good manner, that yes, then it'll be Ireland or Portugal, because all these countries do have significant sovereign debts, and their economies are not operating well enough to service those debts. So it is a problem. I'm not saying that there isn't a problem, but it can all be managed, and this is where you come down to the central banks and the European Union are going to do what it's required to keep it together.
Well, the International Monetary Fund, I think this week, was talking about a lost decade of growth. Even if there's not a catastrophic collapse or a disorderly default by one of these economies, it pretty much is going to be that, isn't it? It's going to be a long haul for Europe and for the rest of the world to pull out of this.
Well, that's right, and unfortunately a lot of people are likening to this potential next 10 years for Europe to what Japan's gone through for the last probably 10 or 15 years, a period of very stagnant growth and not a lot of activity. And I guess that'll come about if we have this big crisis that we're talking about in Europe, that the capital dries up.
When we spoke with you mid-year, there was the possibility of a debt default in the United States, and then you were quite optimistic that Congress would find a way through the deadlock, and indeed it did. Do you have that same sense of faith in the self-interest and the ingenuity of the Europeans to find a timely solution to this?
Well, I try not to be cynical, but I think the self-interest in the Europeans is probably a little bit larger than it was in the American situation, because you've got that real disparate group of countries. They all have very different beliefs and values and the way that they like to do business and deal with each other. There's a number of ancient dislikes amongst countries and those sorts of things, so it's going to be very hard for them to come together. But I think they've created this European Union now. It's sort of worked over the last 20 or 30 years, and I think they would like to keep it, because they recognise to remain as a powerhouse globally, they need to keep that union together. So I think they will do whatever's required. Germany might kick and scream a little bit because they're the ones that are pretty much funding most of it, but I think they want to keep it together as well.
Well, we'll watch with interest. Bevan Sturgis-Smith, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks.